So, all right, hi everyone. It's the second part in George Davey Smith's Odyssey with Mendel. The first part, just about 6 weeks ago, was about the history of the discovery of genes through Mendel, and the second part is the one we've all been waiting for, which is what is Mendelian randomization, a technique that was largely developed by George Davey Smith, who's currently on sabbatical here at UCL, actually from the University of Bristol. What is Mendelian randomization and why it's important, but also why it's subject to being massively misused? I think you're going to tell us about. I'm not going to do much. I've chaired a few events with George, and the best thing for me to do is to shut the hell up and let him get on with it. We're here for an hour and a half, so there'll be an hour of talking plus half an hour of questioning, which I will moderate. But most importantly, and this is George's instruction to me, is that we have a booking at the Marlborough Arms from 6 o'clock in a private room that you are all welcome to come to, and it's 100 yards down the road. So the quicker we get on with this, ladies and gentlemen, George Davey Smith. Thank you.
Just going to set the. I'm just going to set my alarm clock so it goes off when I've spoken for an hour, and then I will shut up and sit down. If I don't do that, then I'll just carry on. Probably. There you go. So I've got an hour. But so yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for UCL and for organising this, for Nish Chaturvedi, who organised my visiting professorship. There's a special guest, Shah Ibrahim, who co-authored the first paper on Mendelian randomization 21 years ago. So, yeah, so I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to talk about what it was, what it is, and what it should become. That's my conflict of interest statement, which is covered up. The thing which says I'm pocketing so much cash from all these companies is carefully covered up with that. Okay. Yeah. No, I can't move the PowerPoints. Now I'm just moving the thing. Okay. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thanks very much. So Mendelian randomization, what it was. So in 2000, Shah and I took over editing the International Journal of Epidemiology. And it wasn't the best time to start editing a Journal of Epidemiology, because in the years leading up to 2000, there'd been a series of very high-profile randomized controlled trials which had tested things which had been sort of identified in epidemiological studies as being important potential causes of disease and important ways of modifying disease risk, in particular antioxidant vitamins. And then a whole host of randomized trials were done of all of these things at the huge cost, which were completely null. And people like Gary Taubes are writing articles in Science about how epidemiology had gone beyond its limits and was actually wasting funding. Taubes called for all the funding to be cut from epidemiology departments and said that that would improve population health. And unfortunately, Shah and I sort of largely agreed with that perspective. And the great thing is that I can now show a cartoon that I've stopped showing about 20 years ago, but I can show it again, which we reproduced in this paper, in this editorial, should we call time to call it a day, which many of you here will have seen. But in this cartoon, you've got today's random medical news from the New England Journal of panic-inducing gobbledygook. And the newsreader says, you know, according to a report released today, and he presses the button and the wheels spin. And, you know, today it's coffee causes hypertension in twins. You know, that's the panic, the news story, because epidemiological findings were coming out and getting headlines based on everything. And of course, every combination on these three wheels, every combination is just nonsense, except red wine does cause sexual dysfunction in men aged 25 to 40, although of course that's a very distant memory for me. So clearly observational epidemiological studies where you just sort of measured stuff A, or exposure A. And then you followed people up, see what happened to them, and you measured all of the things you thought were confounding factors and adjusted for them, just wasn't working. The things which were robust looked very robust to all such adjustments. When they were tested in trials, turned out to be null. So that conventional setup wasn't working, and there's confounders, things which influence your exposure and your outcome. But probably particularly important is reverse causation, is when the disease process influences what you think of as your exposure. Like atherosclerosis starts in sort of late adolescence. It's an inflammatory process. So your C-reactive protein, your IL-6, all these things are increased by atherosclerosis. That sort of reverse causation is really probably the thing which is just impossible to deal with statistically. So you can't deal with that. So the trick with Mendelian randomization was that if you took a genetic variant that reliably related to that exposure, then clearly there couldn't be reverse causation. The outcome couldn't influence the germline genetic variant, what you were given at birth. And there wouldn't be the conventional confounding. I'll come back to talk about this later. The genetic variants wouldn't be influenced by things like smoking or your social position or the standard confounders of observational epidemiological studies. So if you have a genetic variant that related to a difference in cholesterol level, and you grouped people by the genetic variation, the genetic variant, then the people who had the genetic variant that was related to higher on average cholesterol would have exposure across life to higher cholesterol. No confounding, no reverse causation, and the joint association of your genetic variant with your outcome and the genetic variant with the exposure allowed you to calculate or make some sort of estimate of the causal effect of the exposure on your outcome. That was the very simple setup. Now, the fundamental assumption, because why you were doing this was because you wanted to identify modifiable causes of disease. The fundamental assumption was the gene-environment equivalence, which was that it doesn't matter whether you have a higher cholesterol level because of a counterfactual genetic variation that you have compared to other people, or you have compared to you if you didn't have that variant, that would be counterfactual. The exposure, cholesterol, would have the same effect on your outcome, coronary heart disease, as would if your cholesterol level was high because you lived on sausages. So that is in causal inference. That's the consistency assumption. In Mendelian randomization, I hadn't heard of causal inference or consistency assumption 21 years ago, but in Mendelian randomization, the assumption is gene-environment equivalence, and we sort of know that makes sense in some circumstances. So, for example, the condition called pellagra relates to long-term niacin deficiency. The differential diagnosis for that condition would be one of them is Hartnup disease, which is a Mendelian genetic disorder involving the tryptophan niacin pathway. So, and they produce something which looks phenotypically similar or the same, very similar. So gene-environment equivalence can apply, at least in some circumstances, like that. Zucker Campbell. Oh, so and you can't read at the top, which talks about the phenocopy dialectic. Phenocopy is the notion that something in the environment can copy what the genes do. Goldschmidt introduced that term. He was from the US, and the gene was the real thing, and the environment was copying it, so it was phenocopy. And Goldsmith in the Schmalhausen in the Soviet Union simultaneously introduced the term genocopy, because the environment's the real thing, and the genes were copying the environment. But in both situations, you have gene-environment equivalence or gene-environment interchangeability, common in developmental genetics. Zucker, Candle, and Villett wrote a paper 1988 when they said, no doubt all environmental effects can be mimicked by one or several mutations. I think that's sort of largely true, but I think like being hit by a truck, there's probably not a genetic difference which would actually mimic being hit by a truck. But for endogenous disease processes, definitely that is likely the case. So the gene-environment equivalence is that your modifiable exposure, your cholesterol, doesn't matter whether it's diet or cholesterol-lowering medications, or the genetic variation that's altering it, same downstream effect on higher risk of heart attacks. Now, in the cholesterol case, we have, again, good evidence of gene-environment equivalence, because there's at least 5 different cholesterol-lowering drugs which have been tested in massive randomized controlled trials, which reduce your cholesterol level and reduce your risk of coronary heart disease. And the drugs target the specific genes, like statins target HMG-CoA reductase. And genetic variation in HMG-CoA reductase is associated with a higher level of cholesterol and higher coronary heart disease risk. Now, of course, the drug trials only go on for 5 years, on average, say, whereas your genetic studies, as I said at the beginning, are often life. In ALSPAC, the genetic variants related to cholesterol relate to cholesterol level in cord blood and at age 4. So people, if you have a genetic variation, which is underlying a difference in cholesterol, that will be from life, across your entire life. And of course, you wouldn't expect 5 years of cholesterol lowering to reverse a process which has accumulated across your life course. But they scale beautifully. You get about 35–40% of the effect that you would expect from lifetime differences of cholesterol. 40% of that is seen with the cholesterol lowering medication. It doesn't matter which drug it is. It doesn't matter which gene's been targeted. You get that same scaling. The scaling now within vastly more data are the same as it was when Shah and I published a calculation on this in the second MR paper we did in 2004. It hasn't changed, it stayed the same, but there was very few data to calculate it on it then. So gene environment equivalence requires justifying in all situations, and it relates to biological processes that are influenced by genetic variation. So consider a body mass index as a phenotype. So you have some genetic variation relates to higher calorie intake. The first common variant related to BMI, FTO, for example, was shown to relate to a small difference in calorie intake, which across a long period of time results in a higher BMI. This genetic variation relates to physical activity level, and these are also obviously things which will be just sort of standard factors you'd imagine would influence this. And you'd think, yes, gene environment equivalence is possible. But, a cute example often used in the causal inference world is that if you chop someone's leg off, their BMI would go down. It's a very effective way of reducing your BMI, chopping the leg off, but it's unlikely to reduce your risk of coronary heart disease. But of course, there's no genetic variance that leads to you not having a leg. So there's no gene environment equivalence between losing a leg. And a very effective way of reducing weight is smoking. Don't smoke to reduce your weight, honestly. Kids, don't smoke. Kids. Sorry, not sure. Now, for a few things, smoking, if your BMI is lower because of smoking, then your leptin will be lower. But obviously smoking would also have lots of health consequences that are nothing to do with your lower BMI. So a pin-up example of Mendelian randomization in the early days with C-reactive protein, acute phase reactor, everything bad, puts up your CRP, relates very strongly to coronary heart disease. You measure all the confounders, you adjust for them. The effect attenuates by about 1/3, but it stays very robust. Early part of the this century, end of the last century, it was being talked about as the new cholesterol. Pharmaceutical industry were trying to develop drugs that would lower or would inhibit CRP on the basis of a very strong evidence from epidemiology and some, quite a lot of apparent evidence from biological studies. Now, if you look at CRP in the population, it relates to everything bad, as I say, but higher body mass index, smoking, lower social position, bad cholesterol, bad triglycerides, all relate to higher CRP. So, of course, there's a very considerable amount of confounding. But the Mendelian randomization with this variant, which is close to the CRP gene, the promoter region variant that relates to higher levels of CRP, then that variant, just using that single variant, the variant doesn't relate to any of the confounding. The variant relates to CRP at the top, and that heavily, statistically robustly, even 15 years ago, doesn't relate to any of the confounders. So the Mendelian randomization does what it says it does on the scan. It leads to the people with the genetic variant not differing in any other way from the people without it. So you get a clean difference in CRP. And when you do the Mendelian randomization on CRP onto coronary heart disease, absolutely not. Pharmaceutical industry stopped developing drugs to inhibit CRP. Important lesson for any epidemiologists is that 1.49 to 1.33, attenuation of about a third. That's what you expect to see in a completely confounded situation, but because of measurement error in confounders. That's what a null effect looks like. That's what HDL cholesterol and coronary heart disease looks like, and so many other things that turn out to be spurious. When people report results like that and say these are robust, they're not. It's just nonsense. So you can do bidirectional MR. That was one of the early sensitivity analyses. Well, you know, is CRP causing BMI, or is BMI causing CRP? You've just got a correlation. You can't say. But if you do the MR using FTO here of BMI onto CRP, you see that BMI is indeed influencing your CRP level. But you do the reverse direction is CRP influencing BMI, and it's flat. Very clear distinction between the observational associations. So a bidirectional MR, a useful sensitivity analysis. I sort of pin up early finding of MR was that HDL cholesterol, which was known even popularly then as good cholesterol, because it's meant to be good for you. HDL cholesterol, and pharmaceutical industry developed a whole stack of drugs. There's been masses of trials raising HDL cholesterol through a whole series of different mechanisms, all of which turn out to be null. And the Mendelian randomization studies were suggesting that this was null. And Andy Phillips and I, in 1991, wrote a paper doing the sort of sensitivity analysis, taking measurement error into account, and suggested that HDL cholesterol, there was real questions to be asked about its causality, which MR supported. Now, the early examples of MR weren't all sort of calculating causal effects. Is it possible to move that thing at the top?
Three dots up there.
Yeah,
that's right. Go down to hide. Further down to hide floating. That's what.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you. Now I just get a fast escape to show you. Okay, thanks very much. I've learned something. So this is a MR without an instrumental variable, because an instrumental variable is something which relates to your exposure. The first thing an instrumental variable has to do is it has to relate to your exposure. So now we're looking at sheep dip in human health. There were many studies and stories about farmers getting sick due to exposure to a sheep dip. But was this actually causal, or was it basically trying to get compensation, get early retirement, etc.? And how can you tell? Now, there's no genetic variation which makes you a farmer, and within that category makes you a farmer who dips sheep. There aren't any. But there are genetic variants which modify the effect of the nasty stuff in sheep dip. So not to get too, I'm not getting technical here. So, and Nicola Cherry, it's not, we'll move now. Can't move my PowerPoint. Click on the screen. Perfect. God, these are brilliant. Can I employ this in future? Nicola Cherry and colleagues did a great study on this by looking at peroxidase, which detoxified the nasty stuff in the sheep dip, and then looked to see whether amongst farmers who actually dip sheep versus farmers who didn't dip sheep, whether the peroxidase variant related to ill health in the sheep dippers, but not in the non-sheep dippers, and found that it did relate to health in the sheep dippers, which provided evidence that the sheep dip was bad. But you had no instrumental variable, you had no genetic variant which related to sheep dipping. But you could use these, you could get really good evidence on causality. And the early days in genetics, everyone says, well, if you're interested in genetics, then you're a fascist. And secondly, that everything is going to be about doing genetic testing and gene editing or whatever. And so in our first paper, Sean, I repeated this about 10 times. As in the early examples, there's an important caveat. These findings do not support genetic screening and selective employment based on genotype, as some people suffer toxicity from sheep dip regardless of their peroxidase status. The findings simply assist in assigning a causal interpretation to the association between sheep dip exposure and symptoms of ill health. And in 2003, it was really a rather different perspective on genetics to say you were using genes entirely for the purpose of learning about the environment. So that was the point. I mean, another one with where you don't have an IV because you're not looking at genetic variants related to smoking, but you can learn about smoking and bladder cancer here by using a variant in an acetylation gene, where the slow acetylation genotype meant that you got rid of the nasty stuff in smoking, in smoke, which was increasing the risk of bladder cancer. And in non-smokers, it didn't relate to non-smokers, never smokers, it didn't relate to bladder cancer, and ever smokers it did, and there's a dose response form. So without a genetic variant related to smoking, you were learning that smoking was a cause of bladder cancer. And in fact, most of the examples, the early examples of MR were this sort. But now we're in a situation where MR studies are very much about instrumental variable calculations and estimation, which I will say at the end, where I hope to reverse. But at the moment, there's basically 4 types of MR studies using genetic data. You can have summary data on your exposure. So someone can have done a genome-wide association study on your exposure, and those data will be available on the website, i.e. the IEU Open GWAS, one from the IEU, or the Neil Lab from the Broad website, that maintain these data that anyone can pick the data, these summary data, and use them in MR studies. And the main type of MR study now are using summary data for the exposure and summary data for the outcome. In fact, Shah and I did 2 calculations, which would now be called 2-sample MR calculations, one on folate and one on fibrinogen, using summary data. But there weren't many summary data available. So the summary data and summary data, that is we call 2-sample MR, and we'll later hear that these are also called noodles. Then second main type of study would be 1-sample Mendelian randomization, when in your same sample, you generate the exposure associations and the outcome associations. Now, there were quite a few 1-sample studies done in the early days, but the problem with 1-sample MR done in that way is you get what you call overfitting, because you're looking at the same sample, and if there's just some sort of resonance in your data, you will overfit both how you fit the exposure and the outcome will be related, and you get bias towards the observational association. So that's 1-sample MR, but you can get around that with a jackknife. CFANG developed software for doing this, where you, for example, with UK Biobank, you split it into 10 groups, you GWAS 90% of it, apply the exposure effects from that to the other 10%, you get 10 estimates in your meta-analysis. And that then doesn't have overfitting, so that's the jackknife approach. Then you have the hybrid study type, where you use summary data for your exposure, and you apply it to an individual level data study. And UK Biobank, Million Vet studies have driven this approach because you can get those when they have available outcome data, and there's no overfitting because all of how the variance relate to the exposure comes from outside. And then you could, in principle, have a 4th study type, which is very rare, and there's no real examples of that. So those are the types of MR study. So where did the name come from? Mendelian randomization, one might say it came from Mendel. Well, but the first use that we made of it was in 2001, before the first sort of long exposition. We're looking at folate, homocysteine, and coronary heart disease. There was a huge amount of confounding. We'd done a paper saying that, in fact, if you took measurement error into account, these strong observational associations were likely just to be fully generated by confounding. Other people disagreed. But people, because folate was being promoted as should be in the polypill, for example, etc. And one of the main advocates wrote in to complain about our dissing folate. And in that paper, we did a 2-sample MR estimate, just showing very wide confidence intervals with the data available then. But we're putting this forward as a method, and then said, through Mendelian randomization, this tests essentially in compound association. Conventional epidemiological studies have a limited future. Resources should be put into RCTs or future studies utilizing Mendelian randomization. And you see there's a reference 7 there, and that reference was to this paper by Richard Gray and Keith Wheatley, which I'd read when in the early 90s I was doing a course on alternatives to randomized controlled trials at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I was teaching. And I'd sort of come across this as a method you could use other than RCTs. I was also teaching about instrumental variables then. When we then came to do an MR, I didn't even think it could possibly be an instrumental variable. It didn't cross my mind, because I thought instrumental variables were hopeless, because the instrumental variables that one would look at would be things like distance from a well, for looking at water source and how much water people used. And I actually worked on that topic in the late 80s, early 90s in Nicaragua. And I knew that the distance from a well was just so heavily related to other factors that it was absolutely useless as an instrumental variable. And I put instrumental variable into the sort of bullshit category in my mind. But this was amazing. This was a really clever idea for for kids with hematopoietic cancers. Understandably, parents wouldn't want them to be randomized into trials, because it was basically, the mortality rates were so very high, and bone marrow transplantation was a possibility. It was then being developed as a possible therapy, and they had this brilliant idea that what you could do is you could look to see whether that child had a sibling who was HLA compatible, i.e. could get had a ready source for bone marrow transplant, or not. And that was just through the Mendelian laws. If they had a sibling, then it was just the Mendelian random Mendelian processes would mean whether they were HLA compatible or not. And so what you would do is you would look at the children with no genetically compatible sibling. Many fewer of them would actually get a transplant, whereas the children with a genetically compatible sibling, many more would. But if you analyze the 2 whole groups together, that's the equivalent to an intention to treat analysis in a randomized controlled trial. And stroke of genius, thinking about this is very different, of course, for how Mendelian randomization came to be used with measured genetic variation. But I like that the name had stuck, because it's got quite a ring to it, hasn't it? Mendelian randomization. So the name stuck. But then, was it new? So you can search a lot better now on literature. And a few years ago, when I was asked to write something about Mendelian randomization, after 10 years or something, I did quite a lot of searching. And I came across a study from a year before, 1990, in which they called it biological randomization. Now, if I'd seen this rather than the other paper, I probably would have used the term biological randomization rather than Mendelian randomization. And then I found a paper from 1989 which called it meiotic randomization, because of course, as people who came last time will know, that's where the randomization occurs during meiosis and then zygote formation. That's quite a nice name as well. And then I've also come across one genetically randomized. So we can have a vote. Should it be biological randomization, meiotic randomization, Mendelian randomization, genetic randomization? Andrew Hattersley, when I went to him again, early part of this century, and I went through all this before we published anything on it, he said, "Yeah, that's just reverse genetics. It's you're looking at gene to phenotype rather than phenotype to genotype. So it could have been just called human reverse genetics or genetic causal anchors." But anyway, the name has stuck. And it's important that the name is important in that the MR does link strictly to Mendelian processes, i.e. the meiotic process and the transmission of variation from parents to children. We said in the first paper that in fact the analogy to a randomized controlled trial, the thing which was actually truly analogous to a randomized controlled trial, was within family design, when you are actually following the genetic variation to the kids, and you do studies within siblings, which there's now hundreds of thousands of SIB pairs, and you can do these studies at a large scale. But in 2003, there were not large numbers of sibling pairs, we said though, if you move it, and we showed a diagram of it, and we said that if you move to the population, then the randomization is only approximate, and referred to this is approximate Mendelian randomization. And we probably should have stuck with the term approximate Mendelian randomization in population studies, because you haven't got the same protection from population stratification, from the effects of assortative mating, etc., that you have in family studies. And as I say, we didn't think of this in terms of instrumental variables. We reprinted a letter by Martin Catan, which talked about the sort of reverse causation issues in the letter in 1986, and the Lancet it had been cited ground number 2 times up till 2003. And I came across it when revising the paper because it was mentioned in the WHO thing I was asked to referee. Anyway, we asked Duncan Thomas to write a response, and they just pointed out that it was an instrumental variable. And when David Clayton and I, putting our heads in our hands, and we realised we hadn't realised this very obvious thing that this was a sort of instrumental variable setup. So here's your instrumental variable setup. Z is your genetic variant, and this is the one thing you can actually test in instrumental variables. That your instrument has to relate reliably with your exposure. So, and that you can do a sort of statistical test of. The second assumption is that Z is independent of, that the instrument is independent of the outcome, that there's no confounding of the instrument and the outcome. Now, in population-based Mendelian randomization studies, that confounding could exist through population stratification. But in Mendelian randomization, it can actually exist in a particular form of dynastic effects, because of course your parental genotype does cause your genotype, and the parental genotype might influence the outcome, or it might influence the exposure. So how could that happen? So we gave an example in 2003 of this, which is still one of my favorite examples of Mendelian randomization, which is looking at maternal and paternal genotype in relation to neural tube defects. We know now very reliably folate supplementation during should be sort of before conception, soon after conception on, reduces the risk of neural tube defects in the offspring quite markedly. And then looking at the MTHFR, a genetic variation in MTHFR, which could be taken to mimic folate level, and so folate exposure. If the mother carried 2 versions of the variant that lead to lower activity, the offspring had twice the risk of neural tube defect. You have a beautiful negative control here, which is the father's genotype. And the father's genotype, of course, can't influence the intrauterine environment, but there might be other factors are involved. Then maybe you see a father's genotype effect, but you don't. So that tells you that it's likely something that's happening in the intrauterine environment. But if you think about it, if you actually did a sort of case control study of people with neural tube defects or not, at age 20, and you looked at their own genotype, you would get the wrong answer. You would think that it was their folate level that mattered, but it's not their folate level that matters. It's the maternal folate level during development, not what's driven by their variation. So their genotypic effects was the sort of the average of the maternal and paternal effects. We said the same thing. Don't do screening. We're finding out things that can benefit the whole population. So that's the dynastic effect through the intrauterine environment. But there's genetic variation which influences alcohol consumption. And of course, if the parents carry that genetic variation and drink more, the child will grow up in an environment where alcohol is more present. and that will have an impact. My dad was a teetotaler, so that obviously had an impact on me. So the childhood environment can be altered by parental genotypes. And the third assumption is that Z is independent of Y, conditional on X and C. Now, yeah, you think that Z shouldn't influence Y except to X. That's one way of saying it, and that's a nice way of saying it, and that's true. Z shouldn't influence Y except through X. But economists do instrumental variables, so they think of it as sort of adjustment problems. They say, well, adjust for X, but then you've got to adjust for C as well. And you think, well, of course, that's useless because the whole point of Mendelian randomization is you haven't measured your confounders. But sadly, especially in the early days of MR, lots of people used to just adjust for the intermediate phenotype. And there's 2009 Milstein paper which suggested that as a way of testing this assumption, or testing this. Now, only the first assumption can be tested. If you get a test for the second or third assumption, either you deserve a Nobel Prize or it's wrong. And so far, every time people have come up with a test for these assumptions have been wrong. And it's wrong because if you adjust for X, you induce confounding of your genetic variant. And the easiest way to say why this is sort of through an example. Why should adjusting for X lead to confounding be generated? So that's an example of a US college where you can either be admitted to that college because you've got a sporting scholarship, because the US universities love sporting heroes, or you get admitted to the college because you've got very high SAT scores, you're smart. Now, let's imagine that SAT scores and athletic ability are not correlated in the population, they're completely unrelated. But you walk onto the campus of one of these universities and you see a student and you toss a ball at them and they try to catch it and it bounces off their head and they fall over backwards. You can then go to that student and say, you are very clever. Because there's no way they've got to college because of an athletic scholarship. In fact, you get a correlation of -6 between the two in that sort of situation. You can generate really strong associations. It's called collider bias and the causal inference sphere by adjusting for the intermediate phenotype. So don't adjust for the intermediate phenotype and think that's a test of anything. It's just silly. Now, in genetics, that violation is called horizontal pleiotropy. Genes can't cause heart disease without going through a phenotype, has to go through a phenotype, called the phenotype U here. And horizontal pleiotropy is bad news. Of course, we've got another pathway between the gene and the outcome, which isn't through X. Then you've just got biased estimates. There's two types of pleiotropy, genes influencing more than one thing. The other one is vertical pleiotropy. That's when Z influences one phenotype X, which then influences another phenotype. That's vertical pleiotropy. And Mendelian randomization simply is vertical pleiotropy. So when you see papers say there's huge amounts of pleiotropy across the genome, which there is, it's only the horizontal pleiotropic component of that actually biases Mendelian randomization findings. But the vertical pleiotropy might be being mediated through another phenotype. So imagine your genetic variant there is FTO, which we know influences BMI, and then we know BMI influences CRP. If you didn't know that the FTO was influencing BMI, you would take it to be a genetic variant for CRP. You take it to be an instrument for CRP. It's the fourth highest, the fourth strongest association with CRP of any genetic variant, because it's influencing it through BMI. Now, that's sort of okay if you know what that phenotype is and you take it into account. But if you don't know what it is, then you misspecify what the primary phenotype is. You say this is an instrument for CRP. You get the answers completely wrong. If you do know what the phenotype is, then the variant will explain more of the variance. There's the variance in the phenotype that is closest to it rather than the downstream phenotype. And that's the basis of Steiger filtering to work out which the direction is. But the thing which really screws Mendelian randomization is correlated hypertrophy, which would be the situation with BMI, which is where this upstream phenotype, which might be some transcription factor or something, might be anything, some molecular phenotype. That molecular phenotype is influencing what you think it's an insulin for, but it influences other things. And correlated hypertrophy is the thing which really damages MR. So when you're looking at the IV estimates, you've got to follow all the IV assumptions. The exposure period isn't well defined. I talked about, it could be over life for cholesterol, but the exposure period could be at a very specific time. So, for example, it's for multiple sclerosis, vitamin D is related to lower multiple sclerosis risk. MR shows that, but it might well be your vitamin D level when you get infected with EBV as a teenager or adolescent or whatever. It might be that very particular period. So just because you find an association doesn't mean you can intervene and you'll reverse things if you don't know the critical period. I'll skip that. It may only be interpreted in terms of liability to the exposure. If your exposure is like a disease status, having prostate cancer, for example, then you do MR of prostate cancer onto your outcome. If there aren't many, you don't know how many people in your outcomes population actually have prostate cancer. So you don't know that prostate cancer itself, it's the genetic liability to prostate cancer. And indeed, this is the source of lots of negative controls of doing MR of prostate cancer on outcomes in women. And you do indeed see apparent outcomes in women of prostate cancer, but that's because the genetic liability has those influences. And the important thing in the medical sphere is that these GWASs are virtually all of just having disease, not of the disease process. So it just tells you about prevention. It doesn't tell you anything about treatment. So, for example, the GWASs of lung cancer, the top variant is a nicotine receptor variant, which means you smoke more heavily if you smoke, and that's the top variant. But of course, that tells you smoking causes lung cancer. Brilliant. We sort of knew that. But once you've got lung cancer, stopping smoking is no good. And probably for most diseases, things which lead to the progression of the disease are distinct from those things which lead to the onset. So MR isn't telling us at the moment much about disease progression and thus therapeutics. There's lots of sensitivity analyses. I'll start with the top one, zero relevance point. This is one of the first ones introduced with an example. I'll introduce the example through why study alcohol and disease. Well, because hundreds of studies show that higher alcohol intake up to a certain level is associated with lower risk of cardiovascular mortality. These always, or cardiovascular disease, they always get reported widely. This was a study from UCL. This is how it was reported. Moderate drinking can lower risk of heart attack, study says. That's the Guardian. Slightly down market, drinking a pint of beer a day linked to reduced risk of heart attack. Really downline, Mail Online. Cheers, drinkers who have one glass of wine a night have less risk of heart failure than teetotalers. Daily Star, really down market. Drinking alcohol slashes risk of heart problems. If you drink this much per week, four pints. Time, alcohol is good for your heart most of the time. That's the boring version. The Irish Times says, moderate drinking make up risk of heart disease. But now hidden here, it says even drinking lots of pints might lower your risk in the Irish Times. You can study alcohol and disease by genetic variation related to its metabolism. In particular, in East Asian populations, many people carry a knockout in acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. When you drink alcohol in cartoon form, that's converted to acetaldehyde, which gives you all the nasty things that alcohol gives you, like flushing, headache, palpitations, guilt. Actually, it doesn't give you guilt, but it gives you all the other things. And then that's cleared by acetaldehyde dehydrogenase to acetic acid. In these East Asian populations, when the studies were done that we looked at in 2005 and 2008, women weren't drinking at any level, whatever their genotype. For the men, if they were homozygous, the men weren't drinking at all either. So it's hard to drink if you're homozygous with this knockout variant. But you see there's a very strong relationship of alcohol consumption and genetic variation in men. In women, there's not. If there's a pleiotropic effect of this genetic variant, you would see it in women. If it's because of alcohol, you only see the effect of men. And what you see is that alcohol does indeed put up your blood pressure quite considerably, a really substantial amount. It's bad news. So if you do drink, take an ACE inhibitor. You could use this approach now in China, in this fantastic study from China, where they combine sex and geographical place of residence. Now, none of these are colliders. Your genetic variants can't cause, your acetaldehyde variation, the genetic variant doesn't cause your sex and doesn't cause where you live. So there's no collider issue because you can stratify by places where there's very different average levels of drinking and by sex. And that allows you to look at the shape of the relationship. Observationally, you get the standard thing where drinking up to a moderate amount reduces your risk of all these conditions. The bad news is there's no beneficial effect of alcohol. This is one of the most depressing results I was involved in generating. When I was in Scotland, they used to advertise one of the beers was called Old Mortality, so you can't exactly take them to court to say that they're not telling you what's happening. So I'm going to now work my way through these 27 other sensitivity analyses, so they're all equally exciting. Actually, no, I'll skip it. No, the early sensitivity analyses were powerful, like between siblings, powerful sensitivity analysis. Now it's just with all this GWAS data, people just churn these things out, and everyone says that they're robust. So this is the template for the current MR methods papers. Introduction, current methods have limitations. Methods, we simulate data and apply our new method and a handful of previous methods to these simulations. Our method performs best. And the conclusion is we are the champions. So you don't need to read them all. That's how it is. Mendelian randomization can be applied to traits which relate to each other, like childhood body size and adulthood body size. If you do these studies, you should always do negative positive controls. So this is looking at the effect of childhood and adulthood body size on adulthood vitamin D levels. And you see the childhood body size is in red. You see that, of course, because childhood body size has an influence on adulthood body size. They're both in univariable MR relate, but in the multivariable MR, only the adulthood body size relates to lower vitamin D. You see the same correct answer with adulthood levels. You see that it's adulthood body mass index, which influences type 2 diabetes, type 1. In the studies at the moment, they're all recruited in childhood. It's childhood body size. It's adulthood body size, which influences your heart disease risk. There's interesting cases, though, where, for example, childhood body size is protective and quite strong. It gets very, markedly protective in multivariable MR against fractures in later life. And this is because childhood body size has a long-term influence on your bone mineral density level. And the most interesting finding and matching with a very good observational study is that higher childhood body size is protective against breast cancer risk. And that when you look at the known mediators, none of these actually contribute substantially to that, although IGF, some of the effect is because childhood body size is related to lower adulthood IGF. But childhood body size also leads to earlier age at menarche, which increases the risk of breast cancer. And there's a paper from Marie who's got a paper out soon showing that breast density is an important mediator. I'll skip those. Okay, but how is it really? Or the chronicle of a death patrol. So when two-sample MR was taking off, Fernando Hartwig wrote a paper analysing this method and pointing out the quite simple problems that there could be with the method. In that paper, applying it to one paper, that led to this is the first retraction of an MR paper, which we triggered through, but you have to hassle the journals. The journals really don't want to know, even when they publish something which is clearly completely erroneous. Journals don't want to retract things. The authors were quite good here. The authors were actually were good, but there's a real ethical issue about what happens when nonsense is published. No one wants to retract it. The response was Jib Amani said, "Look, we've done every single two-sample MR analysis there is. So you shouldn't publish two-sample MR analyses. They're all available through this automated system. You've got to bring something to the table. You've got to bring some triangulation, something to the table to get it published." But that we got nice reviews from Nature Genetics, but it's never been published. But it is available through Epigraph DB. So all two-sample MR studies have been done. But that doesn't stop. This is the exponential. This is per week. papers with MR in the title, which is heavily underestimates the number of MR papers there are. And it's very simple to work out that in 17.5 months, every single paper in the world will be in Mendelian randomization. So noodles, no nulls, and numbskulls. So lots of these 2 sample papers that things are just silly, like noodle intake. You can't instrument noodle intake. That paper actually is unfair. That went around Twitter. It's the title, Noodles. It's actually pretty well done. It's just that it can't do what it says it wants to do. Causal effect of COVID-19 on cancer risk when your outcome data were collected when there was no COVID around. Lipid-lowering therapy, you see GWASing people taking statins. This is my favorite, particulate matter. They use your postcode, because in UK Biobank, the air pollution is assigned by your postcode. They GWAS your postcode, and then they say everything about your postcode is working through air pollution. And there's hundreds of papers on air, 40, 50 papers on air pollution. This is a website in China where it says Mendelian Randomization Companion Video and Mendelar Code Pack. It says that they tell you how to do it, and they publish a number of high-level SCI, that stands for Science Citation Index, because you get rewards in Chinese universities if your journal is indexed under Sci. And this is actually, you can work out which journal it is. This is a journal with it's I think it's the World Journal, International Journal of Surgery or something. It's got an impact factor of 15.3, and they're saying this is one of the highest. This is one of the really good papers that our factory has produced. The cost is about 370 quid to get. You're guaranteed to get 1 paper in a Sci journal with an exclusive teaching. And one of the students says, "I'm not proficient yet, but in future it will be done in minutes." There are 40 papers with Mendelian randomization on erectile dysfunction and Mendelian randomization. And of course, the gut microbial influences that. And many of the, I counted the 40 which had it in its title, but many other papers are actually MR papers of erectile dysfunction. They just haven't got Mendelian randomization in the title. None of these papers have null results. The important MR findings were things like HDL cholesterol, CRP, fibrinogen, etc., were things which were null. Those are the important early findings. None of these are null. Everything, there's no nulls now. So it's noodles, no nulls. And then the next thing is numbskulls, are just methods which no one can understand, including the authors of the papers that involved them. Vitamin D was a pin-up. Mendelian randomization and the trials agreed that vitamin D supplementation doesn't reduce cardiovascular disease risk. This is an extremely well done systematic review recently published. But suddenly you get a paper saying half the population are going to heavily benefit from vitamin D supplementation by doing a non-linear Mendelian randomization. This is observational, and what you see in the non-linear MR just simply replicates the observational data. Right, get exactly what's in the observational data. This figure was seen by 86 authors, but people notice anything slightly odd with this. All 4 strata are benefiting, and yet the overall effect. Simpson's paradox doesn't generate this when you've got a causal interpretation of your effect and the distribution of outcomes, and this is just nonsense. But this is a noodle. But it gets published. This is just straightforward nonsense, as the 86 authors had seen. It gets published in Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. It would not have got published if it had been a null. They were yet another Mendelian randomization that's a null. You just simply recapitulate the RCT data. I pointed out this was absolutely impossible. The authors then said that we've developed a new method. It does indeed show that it's null. That was so to get 2 papers to get the republished paper after the retracted one, or you could just have done negative control, and we just use the nonlinear method, and you do indeed show that your vitamin D levels at low levels influences your risk of being male, changes your chromosomal sex, and the new method still relates to that, and it changes your age in ways that generate the causal association. Papers are retracted, but it's fucking hard work getting them retracted. And these are really studious group, great group. They submitted that 2 years ago. I got to referee it. I said, yes, this is great, but all the non-linear papers are utter bullshit. So they did the decent thing. They went back and redid the whole thing, excluding all that, and come out with the null. This is a press release for a Me Too paper, which does exactly, hasn't been retracted yet, but it should be. That gets exactly the same answers because it uses biobank and the same method. It gets the same answers. The sunshine vitamin that delivers, and it says it's not ethical to recruit people to trials, and that this genetic approach is great. So this is heartbreaking. Honestly, this stuff is heartbreaking. That this method, which was meant to produce reliable results, is being used to recapitulate bullshit. Gus Hamilton is the first author that today, 8:45 today, he got a message from his pharmacy saying your vitamin D is low. Start taking vitamin D supplements. They tell you to go and buy them. Okay, we could easily buy them, but think of people, people have been told to go and buy stuff, which is snake oil. And we've got the same thing is seen for BMI. You do the nonlinear MR, you just perfectly replicate the big upturn in mortality, which other forms of straight conventional MR just shows don't exist. This is in ever smokers. Now, I am an ever smoker, I have to admit. So their conclusion when they say that increasing BMI to the normal weight category would reduce the risk of all-cause mortality. Brilliant. I believe it or not, I am below the BMI. The BMI where you should increase it, with harm of having low BMI being evident in ever smokers. Brilliant. Knickknacks, here I come. We got these for later. But kids, don't smoke. And don't stratify on a collage. We had published a paper with the negative controls you see for BMI. Tragically, now this is now HDL cholesterol, and this is the nonlinear MR just recapitulates bullshit. These papers are 3N papers. They are both noodles. They're just bullshit. They are no null, and they are numbskulls because people can't understand the methods. Underlying this is that larger and larger GWAS, of course, you just find upstream, you just get more and more and more upstream variants, which means that you ultimately just recapitulate the observational findings. If you know what the confounders are and put them into multivariable MR, remarkably, for something like CRP, you do actually get pretty close to the null if you actually use nonlinear, use multivariable MR to do that. But of course, in many situations, you just don't know what these things are, what these confounding phenotypes are. And here's what I started with. This is the single CRP variant. Now you use all these GWAS variants and you put them together, and it just relates to the confounding. You just recapitulate the confounding in that way. And with gene environment equivalence, the variants near the gene, yes, they're probably reasonable. But body mass index, smoking, IL-6, anonymous trans variants, none of those are, meet the gene environment equivalence. So if you think about gene environment equivalence, you would realize this is no good. Now, some of the people here will remember the Ratner's jewelers, this very vulgar jewelers, always had a perpetual sale. They never didn't have a sale on. And does anyone remember what happened to Ratner? Gerald Ratner. I am now the Gerald Ratner of MR. And Ratner said, how can you sell this for such a low price? I said, because it's total crap. We even sell a pair of gold earrings for under £1. Some people say that's cheaper than a prawn sandwich. I have to say the sandwich will probably last longer than the earrings. So I am the Ratner, but I'm going to have what is to be done. Journals shouldn't send out papers to review if they're just two sample MR. Reviewers should refuse to review them. Journals shouldn't send out to review MR papers. I've got the strobe MR checklist completed, which should be reviewed. And the method should be more rigorously evaluated with the use of negative and positive controls. So what it should become in 4.5 minutes. First, I think MR it shouldn't really be used for MR studies. What it should be is part of a triangulation of evidence approach when you're actually trying to see whether something is likely causal and you can't haven't got randomized trials, want to decide what to spend the money on in terms of randomized trials. MR is useful in that context, particularly if you've got a pre-specified protocol for your triangulation activity. In those circumstances, it can be very valuable. I think it should reconnect with biology and just cease to be mechanical application of instrumental variable analysis. Lots of the things with the genetic variants, you can't get a sensible IV estimate. IV estimate that means anything, but the genetic associations are telling you something about the phenotypic pathway leading up to the outcome. I think people who work in the area should contribute to the collection of appropriate data. What we really need are clinical cohorts, when I said about the fact that all the GWASs are having a disease. We want cohorts of people with lung cancer and follow them up and then do MR things which actually influence disease progression. That will be valuable and would speak directly to therapeutics. We also need methods development for taking into account the automatic collider bias that you get from just starting with people who've all got a disease. But such methods are under development and are being evaluated. So should connect to therapeutics. I think it should be applied to questions of natural selection with Mark here and Melanie and Richard from Bristol. We use some basically simple data showing that the lactase persistence variant just doesn't really relate to milk consumption. That's useful because that's suggesting that any hypothesis, which is that the selection was actually due to drinking more milk, it at least challenges that. Now, of course, you don't know how it related 3,000 years ago, but that's a very simple use. I mean, one could actually move on because fitness is a phenotype, and Mendelian randomization, including in non-humans in particular, can be applied to study what is the actual phenotype that selection is working through. Because pleiotropy is an issue, obviously, in natural selection, and selecting a phenotype through the clustered groups of phenotypes. There's a talk online that Mark invited me to give. I think you invited me. Maybe someone else didn't. You were stuck with having to host me. But anyway, I gave an UCL a year and a bit ago, I think, on MR applied to selection. People are interested. We applied to non-human life forms. I was particularly pleased to see this study of milk production in German Holstein cows. Pretty well done, and looking at serious, things that actually could be modified to try and improve milk production. Should be a component of the toolbox of approaches for identifying ubiquitous exposures as causes of disease. I can't explain that in 10 minutes. But if I do give a third talk here, I don't know, I'm going to get invited back. This is what my third talk will be on. So I will explain this in another hour, if I'm given another hour. Anyway, here's some more non-human. This is improving rice yield production. I like seeing that stuff. And finally, I think it should be combined with studies of somatic mutation. So combined Mendelian and Darwinian approach. And what I mean by this is that inside, you're born with your germline genome, and that germline genome stays with you through life. But we are all packed, I've got bad news for people, we're all packed with huge numbers of somatic mutations, which, if they could be actually isolated, would be driver mutations. There would be things that, if they're in a cancer, they would be said to be a driver mutation. It's just that the vast majority of those don't get to the state of clonal expansion, of being released from the control there is of surrounding tissue. So again, this natural experiment where every gene and everyone, but get to my age anyway, every base pair would have had a mutation in at least one of my cells, if you do the maths. Where you can actually, this is what I think will happen in 20, 30 years' time, will be possible to do. You'll be able to follow the evolution of clones, because it's not just cancer, other diseases, somatic mutation is likely to apply in many diseases. So you can have this wonderful dream of this combined Mendelian and Darwinian approach to understand individual biology, and in similar ways with single cell data, genotype single cell data, you can do these approaches. These things are really, really exciting. So I did the Gerald Ratner thing, forget the noodles. There's no way of stopping that. That's the problem, is because these journals that are semi-predatory, like Frontiers, publish these papers, but they're not seen to be predatory. They're on the side, so people get rewarded for producing papers for them. I don't know what can be done about that, but it trashes Mendelian randomization. The noodles, the no-nulls, and the numbskulls are all just trashing the approach. I feel upbeat about it, obviously. And thanks to all these people. Particular word for the late Richard Gray, who died recently, but who gave me a lot of information about the early days of thinking about the HLA approach. Thanks to them. The further reading is that no one reads the original paper, so nearly everything in it's wrong, but the principle is good. Eleanor Sanderson's paper is a very comprehensive and a sober review of methods. There's the 6th International Mendelian Randomization Conference in sunny Bristol. The sun is guaranteed. There'll be no rain. 19th to 21st of June. I'm just trying to sell a fucking conference, so we're just trash building. But anyway, come to the conference. There's a bike tour of all the breweries, and there's drinks after the discussion in the common room in the Marlborough Arms pub, and at least the first drinks will be covered. And I think that's it. I don't think I've got anything after that. No, that's it. I'll leave that slide on. Thank you very much. So. I was only 127 seconds over.
So a completely useless method that's been completely bastardized, and you shouldn't address it at all. So let's just have questions from the floor. I'm just to start off with, I couldn't help notice that so many of those noodles papers were coming out of China.
Yeah.
What is the incentive
structure? The people are paid for, the universities pay people to get them, and the pay is based on the impact factor. So exactly the same thing happened with meta-analysis about 15 years ago. That all of a sudden meta-analyses were taken over. All became Chinese. So that website I showed you is the website that's advertising for people to we can show you how to produce noodles at the cost of £377 per noodle.
Is there?
Oh no! They had these packages where they needed 5 papers. You could get you get a discount. The more papers you have in, the cheaper, and you get coaching, presumably writing coaching, as part of the deal.
Do we teach someone who runs a genetic course here? Do we teach MR on any of our? What level of?
Well,
I'm not really teaching it.
Well, no, not really, because I mean it's about the journals and stuff. Like it's a real big problem if you're on the editorial board of, say, British Journal of Psychiatry, which then it's very difficult to refuse a paper that you don't understand.
Yeah.
And even genetics people, there's a tiny minority of people who understand Mendelian randomization. So you get a paper in, it looks like it's showing you something. And how are you going to reject it? Very few reviewers understand it properly. And so, it's actually much easier to get a weak genetics journal into a non-genetics, and a weak genetics paper into a non-genetic journal. You get into real high-ranking journals. And I was literally on the board. I literally said we do not accept any papers that have Mendelian randomization on, because that was, it's really great to hear George saying about how valuable the null ones are, and that's exactly what I think they're very good for. But nowadays, yeah.
Well, I mean, that is a broader issue in scientific function, and the same can be applied for almost any mention of genetics in journals like Intelligence. Just thought I'd float that, see if I got any reaction from the audience, but nothing. Go on, and let's have some questions from the floor.
Hi, thanks so much as well. I work at lung cancer lab here at UCL. Great. A lot of our work looks at lung cancer evolution. Particularly mouse-based models, which suggested that the EU mutations in next ranges would lead to lung cancer. The ecological analysis on that, which was the first figure, which was very simple correlatory analysis, was very weak, and it was just something that linked some of the mouse work with the human work. But we're now looking to kind of expand that further. So, how would you say is the best way to approach trying to look at air pollution, which, as you say, is quite hard to measure?
Yeah. So
repeat the question, because there are 1,000 people watching online.
1,000 registered. The question was, how could you use this for studying air pollution, for example, and lung cancer? The paper's great. It is a sort of triangulation paper which combines all these things. The paper that you were involved with, that you mentioned. So I think that's the sort of situation where obviously you can't get genetic instruments for being exposed to lung cancer, but it's actually being exposed to air pollution. But it's like the peroxidase example, or the bladder cancer example I was giving, where you could have genetic modification of the response to the air pollution, which and that requires a very considerable amount of of expert knowledge about the area, and you can get that through animal studies, etc. You can work out see the genes that are involved in the acetylation, and smoking was studied in a lot of detail in animal models, and then what you would expect is if there is effect modification by a genetic variant, then you would expect to see this interaction between the obviously with error reported exposure data and the genetic variant. But the error won't generate any difference in the genetic variation of the person or in the extent to which there's an interaction. So you can study exposures that you can't instrument either through interactions or a second approach. A couple of slides on it I took out because luckily otherwise I'd have been 3.5 minutes over. Which is you can also use genetics to understand confounding, because when you have these replicable associations in population studies, it's not noise, it's not random, it's not false positive. These things are just massively replicable, highly statistically robust. There must be a causal structure underlying why you get those associations. And if you work out that causal structure, then that might actually point you to a thing that you haven't been identified as influencing the outcome. So the incredibly replicable lower risk of coronary heart disease in people with higher HDL cholesterol, whatever is driving that must be an important cause of coronary heart disease. Whatever's driving those associations. And Gus Hamilton just had a paper out in Critical Care when he was looking at HDL cholesterol, but not coronary heart disease. He was looking at small HDL, which has been shown to predict lower mortality, and quite substantially lower mortality if you have sepsis, lower sepsis mortality, and shows that IL-6 activity both lowers the small HDL moiety and obviously has a large effect on sepsis mortality, having done MR effect IL-6 onto sepsis mortality, and and that really suggests that one should be doing a trial of IL-6 blockade in sepsis in general. And this obviously was used in COVID and did reduce COVID mortality, but what you're doing there is you're using the Mendelian randomization principles to work out what are the factors that are confounding that lead to confounding the association or associations.
Okay. Thank you. I was just wondering, and kind of leads from the answer that you just gave about moving away a bit from thinking about biological specificity and the need for laboratory instruments, and thinking about polygenic scores for example, complex phenotypes, and thinking using genetics in that way, and then using it in like a counterfactual approach, for example.
Yeah, so I think genetics have a huge value in understanding phenotypic causation outside. I think Mendelian randomization is just one of a family of methods. I mean, I think a powerful use of that has been with paracetamol intake during pregnancy, and paracetamol intake during pregnancy has been associated with just so many adverse outcomes, such as higher asthma, attention deficit, and various other outcomes. If you can then actually look at the polygenic scores in the mothers and to see if they relate to paracetamol use in a way which would, because of course the mothers transmit their genetic half of the kids' variation. And indeed, you find that the polygenic, this has been reported in 2 studies, that the polygenic scores for ADHD actually predict paracetamol use in the direction that would generate a confounded association. And now, of course, as the confounding is by phenotype, you would actually want what that doesn't do is actually say what the full confounding would be, because you're only looking at one aspect of it, because it's likely that the phenotypic component, you can't break them into components, but the phenotypic influences on ADHD and aspects will also probably influence paracetamol use. So you can combine what you know about the proportion of heritability in the trait explained by the genetic variation with what is picked up by the instruments you're using, and sort of multiply up, if you like, multiply up the extent of confounding that would be generated. So it can be, I think it can be very valuable use for, outside of just identifying causal effects through direct genetics, if you like, through reverse genetics.
Any other questions? Well, so I know there's a little cohort of evolutionary biologists dotted around the audience. Why don't you take us through the paper from a couple of years ago about lactase resistance? Because it was a big paper, and we did quite a meaty job of trying to communicate it much broadly, because it runs counter to what we've been teaching for 20 years, what came out of this largely out of UCL about lactase persistence.
Yeah.
And Mark Thomas is a cohort.
So Mark can correct me when I'm wrong and interrupt me, because that component of looking at lactase persistence and current phenotypes is just one component of what was a sort of triangulation of evidence, which to simplify and summarize rather generally is that Richard Evershed has been spent years documenting when it appeared that humans started consuming or using milk in geographically, and then also there's ancient DNA data which can say something about when lactase persistence increased to what would have been near zero, when it increased, and you can say to an extent where. And then Mark did modelling of factors which appeared to relate to to higher lactase persistence, and the suggestions that things which actually sort of triggered the selection, because humans were consuming milk, and presumably most of them were consuming milk independent of the fact, well, they were all lactase non-persistent to start with. So the
original assumption was that it was the mutation which allowed them to
drink more milk, yeah,
and therefore drank more milk. And we've been teaching that for what, at least 20 years.
Yeah, yeah, before that, 1971 wasn't it? Flats and yeah.
Well, I was reading it then.
Yeah, yeah.
but the idea that the lactase, therefore you drank more milk.
Yeah,
that was the reverse cause, like as well. But it was George. It's a great triangulation. It's a good triangulation because he said, "I don't see any effects of the UK biobank at all."
But the key missing bit of data was that the adverse health effects that we have been saying people stop drinking milk because of all sorts of adverse health effects after weaning actually didn't prevent people from drinking milk.
Yeah, and you see much less of them, and I mean that's also what's seen when people are genotyped to present with not doing well with milk. Yeah, there's not a very strong relationship between the actual lactase persistence and whether their gut is producing lactase or not isn't strongly related. Yeah, but the story was that we when in the 2004 paper Sean and I wrote, we wrote believing the stuff that you were teaching, that one thing once the variant was found, it was actually identified in 2002 by Lane Pelton and others. That would be a great way of separating groups into people who drank more and less milk. And we genotyped it in Shah's study, the British Women's Heart and Health Study, and then did the analysis, and it wasn't related to milk consumption, so we thought the genotyping was wrong. We went back and investigated in every possible way, eventually wasn't, wrote it up, postulating that in fact it was possibly what was happening was everyone was drinking milk when everyone started drinking milk when milk became available, and then when populations were large enough for infection to be maintained in the population to circulate, when you did get diarrheal disease, it's an osmotic force, and you dehydrate and die more, and that's particularly bad in evolutionary terms if you're dying before you have kids. So that could lead to rapid selection, and that was rejected by 7 journals with increasingly virulent reviews saying this is nonsense.
But then we had a proxy for pathogen exposure,
yeah,
and it actually did explain natural selection on that better than constant, or better than milk use, a lot better than
And the speed of the big set of how.
I mean, it went from relatively low levels. You don't know what was really happening obviously before, but it went really 3,000 years.
Sorry,
Well, when it went to a really dramatic increase, it might, we don't know, about 3,000. Yeah. Yeah.
The alternative explanation is that lactase persistence means you get more calories out of the milk.
I agree.
And that seems to be perfectly plausible, and it fits with your data as well.
Yeah, no,
it's more of a driver when nutrition is not around, and actually lactose intolerance is a very rare syndrome.
But why did it take off 3,000 years ago, not 10,000? If it's because of the extra calories, then but why didn't it take? It wasn't taking off when people were getting extra calories and there was some around.
We don't get some calories from milk.
Once
I think they were going.
No, they could work together. Yeah.
One extra calories, it's extra calories. So it's modulating selection from extra calories. And work with dynamic property.
There's been a really interesting just out of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, interesting randomized trial of milk in people who have been genotyped and shown to be lactose non-persistent, which is but I mean, I think both are worth need investigating. I don't think it ties in quite so well about saying the when. I mean, why? It doesn't really. But it could well be both together. I mean, it is. They're both plausible, and they both could have a role and had a role in different places. I mean, there's been four different emergencies. Is it still 4, Mark? And it might be different. It might have been for different. The drivers might be different.
Any more questions? There's one online question. Oh, online questions. How's that? Who thinks that George should come back and give a third lecture?
This isn't putting a hand on. She's thinking, oh God. Rebecca's thinking, hang on. Another PowerPoint email, 4 minutes before.
So you've got one that says, should GWAS and MR be by default sex stratified?
GWAS and that's an interesting point. I mean, that there was a nice, I think it was Nature Genesis, nice paper.
What's the question?
Should GWAS be by default sex stratified? Did it say sex and age or just sex?
It said GWAS and MR by default sex stratified.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the phenotype whether that would be automatic. But I mean, certainly, I think every GWAS now is sex stratified. I mean, people they might not be reported in that way, but they will report it whether there's any sex interaction, for example, any sex interactions. And there's quite a lot of phenotypes where you do show differences, and that actually is a really quite nice. Gives you a quite nice sensitivity analysis in MR, because if there's a larger genetic effect in one sex and a variant on a phenotype, then you would expect on an intermediate phenotype, an exposure phenotype, you'd expect there to be a larger downstream effect on the outcome.
Okay, we've got two more. I'm going to see if this works because I'm going to see if they can talk. So, Nazri, if you're possible to ask your question.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you for your talk. It was a great talk. I just had a quick question regarding nonlinear MR. You talked about it in the presentation. What are the biggest challenges with running a nonlinear MR? And do we have any way to triangulate an observational analysis that is nonlinear using genetic tools? Is there anything we can do for that?
Yeah. So I actually showed something which was a nonlinear MR near the beginning when I showed the alcohol data in China, and there what you could do there, because there was just very different levels of exposure in the groups. So when you defined it by 10 regions in China, which included some regions in Muslim areas where there was really rather little drinking. And compared to one of the cities where there's reasonable amounts of drinking, and you stratify by sex, you actually get groups which have really quite different levels of average exposure. And then if you just do your straightforward MR within these non-collider defined groups, you can get some sense of the effects at low levels and then higher levels. And it was precisely that I showed in the Lancet. Millwood et al. In the Lancet 2019 presents that and shows you have observationally you have this dramatic J-shaped curve with stroke mortality, but with the MR and with actually being able to define reasonably well at the lower end, you just got linear increases. So there are ways. If there's ways of actually getting populations with very different exposure levels, then you can do it.